coming back to Hallfield School this evening to be our guest speaker. What do you remember about Hallfield School? Any particular happy memories?
Oh gosh, yes, lots, and it's been really fascinating having a look around the school. And as I've been looking around, the word "oh wow" has been coming out of my mouth repeatedly, because the developments that have been in the incredibly long time since I was here are really quite remarkable. But there's bits that really came back very powerfully. There was an area outside what used to be the headmaster's office with an old clock where if we had misbehaved, we were told to go and sit and wait. And seeing that clock brought back a few memories, I can tell you. Down in the playing fields, there's a cottage that I remember our Latin teacher, Mr. Fisher, and his wife, not surprisingly, Mrs. Fisher, they lived, and in the basement they had a wonderful model railway, and I can still smell the sensation from there. It's odd, the memories that come back, it really is. And the other thing is just, I'm really puzzled about things like what colour our uniform was, because my photographs, of course, are all black and white. I mean, I'm that old. And all your blazers are red, and I'm certain ours weren't red, but I can't remember what they were. I think they were green, might have been grey.
Well, when I first came, the boys wore grey suits.
Right.
And the girls, who obviously came after the boys,
Yeah.
27 years we've had girls now at Hallfield.
That's the other big
That's
change.
big change. So yes, they had red blazers, and one of the things I've done in my time here is move so all of the children are in the same colour blazer, and the red is so distinctive.
Certainly is.
We've moved away from the sort of rather bland grey suits and put everybody in bright red blazers.
Yeah, there's a photograph from my era of the headmaster, the deputy head, and about probably the prefects or something, and they all look so middle-aged and almost like they're in grey suits, and they were only 12 or 13. I mean, it's extraordinary. So, yeah.
So probably grey.
Probably, but again, I've got this sensation that might have been a privilege for the very senior boys.
Right.
It's it's really odd. But
so clearly tonight you're going to talk about your career in medicine, and a very long and distinguished career. At what point did you decide that medicine was the career path you wanted to pursue?
Well, if I tell you, my dad was a doctor, my brother was a doctor, both my sisters were nurses, my mum was a dispenser, my aunt was a dispenser. That proves one of two things. Either I have absolutely no imagination, or medicine is genetic. I think I was inspired by my dad. My dad died when I was a young teenager, and I remember even at his funeral realising how much his life and career had meant to his patients. And that looked a pretty good career to me.
And was he a GP?
He was a GP in Selly Oak, yes. Initially in Bournebrook and then in Selly Oak, and then went into partnership with my brother and my brother-in-law, so quite a family business there.
So you spent most of your career as a GP in Cambridge?
Yeah, I was a GP in Cambridgeshire for, I'm always astonished when I say this, but for 36 years. And during the course of that time, I got very interested in medical education and taking on medical students and doctors who were training to become GPs. I also was doing quite a lot of writing and broadcasting and so on at the time, so it was even back then, it was quite a varied career.
So in terms of being a GP general practice, obviously there's some, I don't know, what's the word, sort of, GPs can be looked on less favourably, generalists than specialists, perhaps not just in medicine but in other walks of life as well. What are your views on that?
I find it absolutely fascinating and completely illogical. I've never really understood why the smaller your area of expertise, the higher your prestige. So if you're an expert in the left lobe of the liver or something, that's something to be really impressed about. But throughout my career, I mean, it happened to me this week. Somebody said, "What sort of doctor were you? Were you a specialist or just a GP?" I've had that phrase used, the just word, used throughout my career. To me, it doesn't make sense. If you're dealing with most of the problems and most of the population, most of the time, the skill required to do that well is an astonishing level. So I'm not knocking specialists, I'm just mystified at the denigration of generalists. And it's not just in medicine, it's across so many other professions. And I don't know quite why it happened, but my attempt to fight back, let's put it that way.
Well, I'm totally converted because my degree's in geography, but I started life primary school teacher.
Yeah.
So I was always the same issue really. Well, what subject do you teach? Well, actually I teach all of them, or I teach children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which was always seen less favourably than I teach maths or I teach science and so on. So
it's intriguing. I genuinely struggle to work out quite what that's about. Maybe good general practice, well, like good anything, looks easy. Like watching a good cricketer play an off drive looks so easy, or a tennis player looks so easy. Go and see a good GP do a good consultation. They're just sitting in a room, that looks a piece of cake. Actually, the complexity of what's going on, as in teaching, is really quite remarkable. But we don't always have the sort of the high-tech kit and the stuff that makes people think, oh, that's impressive. Because the complexities of a consultation, of really understanding what matters to the human being you're dealing with, is an amazingly complex task.
You just mentioned moments ago about broadcasting and indeed writing. So tell me about your sort of love of language and literature and how that influenced your career in medicine.
Well, it entirely happened here. We had a teacher, an English teacher called Mr. Amphlett, and I'd just seen a photograph of Mr. Amphlett while I've been looking around this afternoon, and I'd completely forgotten that he had a clerical collar. So he must have been a clergyman of some sort. Anyway, we always called him Mr. Amphlett, and what I remember is if I put up my hand to say, please sir, can I go to the toilet? He would say always the same thing. Haslam, of course you can go to the toilet. The question isn't whether you can, it's whether you may. And it was this precise use of language and his encouraging me to choose the right word and to buy my first thesaurus and to think about my writing that absolutely stimulated my interest in the use of the English language in writing. And so at school, at my next school, I was involved in sort of setting up a couple of vaguely satirical magazines and writing for the school magazine. And then at medical school, I did some writing there. And then as I started as a GP, I started submitting articles to magazines. And fantastically, this was pre the world of blogging, because these days these had been blogs submitted into the world for no payment, but in my day I got paid.
So are you optimistic about the future of the NHS?
Yes, I think, what was that wonderful saying, the NHS is the closest thing the English or the British have to a national religion. It's said in jest, but even when there's huge problems in the NHS, as there are at the moment, the vast majority of the population are immensely proud of an organisation that will provide healthcare, irrespective. If you're a duke or in the gutter, it doesn't make any difference. You should get the same level of care. When I had my cancer treatment, I remember waking up for my first treatment thinking, isn't it incredible to live in a country where I hadn't had to worry about what this all cost? That my fellow citizens have paid for my care like I've paid for them. I think that's an extraordinary, one of the great achievements of mankind, humankind, I think, is the health service. So we have to preserve it.
And in terms of funding of the NHS, how do we manage talked about the over-medicalisation, the just because we can do things and some of the new treatments cost huge amounts of money, where do you draw the line? Well,
there are a number of ways you can look at this. You have to work out what your priorities are. I mean, I've had the privilege of addressing health ministers from around the world, and I've addressed the World Health Assembly in Geneva, and I've asked them all the same question. Do you know what you're trying to achieve? What is, and no one has ever given me an answer about what the real end game of healthcare is. For 6 years, I was chairman of NICE, the organisation in England that determines whether new and expensive treatments are cost effective. In other words, is the cost justified? And this is hugely controversial area. I mean, frequently I'd see letters from people saying, you can't put a price on these things. The price of life is far. And I know if it was my family, I'd be happy to spend the entire United Kingdom's gross domestic product on keeping them going. But what about everybody else's family? And what about so it's not. You have to draw the line somewhere. and you need methods of trying to do that in a fair and just way.
Thinking about sort of comparing the NHS with health systems overseas, you've travelled extensively. Is there a particular country with a different approach to healthcare that you think we should take on board some of their ideas or approach?
I think probably all of them we should take on board the best bits, but not the worst bits. So the United States, for instance, when it's good, when care is good there, it is fantastic. The vast majority of the population have appalling care. The United States, as a nation, spends double the proportion of gross domestic product on health that we do, and has far worse outcomes across the board. As I say, if you're wealthy, well insured, then you're fine. But otherwise you're not. You look at Cuba, a totally different country, a very poor country, but they've invested in public health, in primary care, in clean water, and so on. Some of their outcomes are better than most of the United States. It's quite extraordinary. So it's not a question of just the more you spend, the better the care. It's take the best ideas, work out what you're really trying to do, focus on those, and I'd be happy to take ideas from anywhere. But when people say, well, surely we should shift to part payment or part insurance and part NHS, well, it's still money. I mean, it's not as if it takes the money away. It's a trick that can take it out of the Chancellor's pocket, but it still leaves all of us to pay. So you've got to find out the best way of getting the maximum bangs for your buck, and also recognise when it's inappropriate and when we shouldn't be medicalising, when we should be looking at different approaches. So when the COVID pandemic first hit, what was the government's first reaction? It was to build extra hospitals. We have the Nightingale hospitals, which are an incredibly impressive piece of activity, to build far, far more hospitals, which then weren't used because they haven't got the staff to put in them. So we've learned staffing is a major issue in the health service. We've learned that prevention is, in so many aspects, the way forward. So preventing people from getting COVID. Those horrendous scenes we saw at the beginning of the pandemic of people struggling to breathe, of dying in large numbers in intensive. Immunisation has wiped that out, almost completely wiped that out. And for me, that's a measure, and it's brought into real focus how if you focus on prevention of so many aspects of healthcare, you'll get far, far better results than waiting. I think it was Desmond Tutu who said that if you buy a river and you keep seeing bodies floating past, you can sort of try and pull them out, or it's much better to go upstream and see why they keep falling in. And that for healthcare, go upstream, see what you can do to really address some of the determinants of health, many of which are down to poverty, education, things like that.
Do you think vaccines should be compulsory?
No, absolutely not. I think we should encourage everyone to have them. I think we should educate, but I think personal human autonomy is critical. And I think the side effects, to use the title of my book, the side effects of making something mandatory would be to drive paranoia and anxiety that this is the government trying to do something to us rather than the government trying to do something for us.
Thinking about students at Hallfield and then older students and so on, would you still encourage them to pursue a career in medicine?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's the most. I think the sheer privilege of being part of other human beings' lives at some of the most challenging, worrying, exciting, positive times of their life is fantastic. I think it. Yes, it's not an easy career. It has its challenges. We desperately need better workforce strategy in this country. But Hallfield pupils, I hope, by the time they come through the system, I don't think you can beat it.
And finally, you're raising some money this evening for a charity very close to your heart. So, Young People versus Cancer.
Young Lives, yes, it's a charity. As I mentioned, a few years ago I had cancer and realised that despite 36 years or 50 years in the NHS and 250,000 consultations, I didn't know what it was like to have cancer until I had it, and it's pretty terrifying. And then thinking what that must be like for the families of young people, children and people up to the age of 25 with cancer. I mean, I would rather go through what I went through 1,000 times than have any of my grandchildren or children go through that. And so I became chair of a charity called Young Lives versus Cancer. It used to be known as Click Sargent. And before that, the Malcolm Sargent Fund for Cancer. And we support families who are going through the whole experience of cancer and young people, and absolutely put them at the centre of what we're trying to do to support them.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely my pleasure.